It is well. It is well with my soul. With my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul.
Well, welcome back. We are into week number 7 of the way that we're doing things nowadays. Lord willing, we'll be together soon. So keep posted for word on what that looks like in the near future. Today we are going to finish up in the chapter number 2 of the book of Daniel. We're actually going to be looking at chapter 2, verse 24 to the end of the chapter. And I want us to keep in mind what exactly has been going on in our history of God dealing with His people. At this point in history, we see that God has His people held captive in a foreign land, and we know that foreign land to be Babylon. God actually had been telling His people since the Exodus that if they obeyed Him, things would go well. But if they did not obey, things would actually go very bad for them. And one of the punishments for disobedience, God had told them a long time before, He said that He would actually bring foreign enemies against them. And that's exactly where we are in our history of the nation of Israel. We see the 10 northern tribes have gone away. We see now Judah has fallen into the same idolatrous temptations and idol worship. And they themselves find themselves now in the throes of Babylon. They're stuck there. Well, Daniel here in chapter 2 has actually had the opportunity to exercise the gift that God had given him. Remember, the king had a troubling dream, and he called for all of the soothsayers, all of the astrologers, to interpret his dream. And he asked them not only to interpret the dream, but to actually give him the dream itself. And he did that to kind of get through all of everything that went along with the interpretation of dreams. He wanted to get through all of that, and he wanted them to tell him exactly what the dream was and its interpretation. And we see that no one could do it. So in walks Daniel. Here stands Daniel, and he actually does the thing that God had prepared him to do. So he prays, God gives him the dream, and God gives him the interpretation of that dream. So let's pick up here in verse number 24. We're going to read through 24 through 30. Come back and give some commentary along the way. But I wanted to remind us that the title of the sermon today is a title that you may not know unless you're probably 40 years old or better. And the title of the sermon today is Get a Piece of the Rock. Now, that was an old advertisement from the 70s, maybe into the 80s. But it was an advertisement that had people have the assurance of getting a hold of the rock. And this rock was an insurance company that they could invest in. So we're going to look today at the rock and how we get a piece of the rock. So look at verse number 24 through verse number 30 as we read, and then we'll come back and look at the commentary. It says, "Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, 'Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation.' Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, 'I have found a man in the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation.' The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar." Remember, that was Daniel's new name in the kingdom. Remember, they had changed their names, their hairstyles, their clothing. And one of the names, or one of the things they did was change the name of Daniel to Belteshazzar. So the king asks Daniel, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Verse 27, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets and has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Keep that in mind, latter days. We're going to hit that here in just a little while. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while in your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. So, back to verse number 24. You can glass your eyes over that as I give some commentary along the way. Daniel quickly gets a hold of the executioner here in verse 24. And he tells the executioner, don't kill anyone. Now he could have said, don't kill anyone else, because it's possible that he had already started the execution of some of these wise men of Babylon. But in any case, Daniel stops his hand and he says, get me an appointment with the king. I have answers for him. So check out this guy's response when he shows up in front of the king. Arioch shows up in front of the king and he says to him, I have found a young man of the Jews who is able to interpret your dream, king. I have been searching high, I have been searching low, and I finally found someone who is able to help you. When in fact, Daniel was the one who was seeking Arioch to stay his hand. And isn't that just like our fallen nature? We take the credit in order to make ourselves look better when we actually had nothing to do with it in the first place. It's just like our sin nature, always scheming, always conniving in order to try to give ourselves the advantage over someone else. Well, Daniel steps up and lets the king know all of the king's wisest men could not give the dream or the interpretation to the king. Daniel is about to lay down some good theology to this pagan king. And he says this, in essence. He says, King, your faith is misplaced. Your trust is misplaced. You have put your faith and you have put your trust in the schemes and the wiles of men. It's not going to work. You've seen that with your own eyes, right? You have tried to get them to tell you not only the interpretation, but the meaning of this dream, and they have failed miserably. But, he separates it with that word, right? But, there is a God outside of the human realm who is able to reveal it. And we see here in verse 28, these things that you dreamed, O king, will take place, and notice the time frame. Latter days. In the latter days. Now, this short phrase is of utmost importance in how we will see the prophecies revealed in the book of Daniel. So, the question comes up, really, when are the latter days? Well, we may say, what's the end of all time? It has to be. Or is it? It would be helpful if we could find someplace else in the scriptures that uses that phrase, the latter days, to help us out. Well, I actually have a couple of them. If you want to turn there, you can to Genesis chapter number 49, the very first verse. We see that Jacob is on his deathbed and he is blessing his 12 sons. And this was very important for a father to pass down the blessings on his sons. This is not something that we're familiar with in our day and age, but to the Old Testament Jew, to have that blessing handed down from your father meant the world. So here he is handing down his blessings to his 12 sons. And he begins here in verse number 1, and he comes to the phrase of when these things will happen. And you'll see the same phrase laid out if you have an Old King James, a New King James. I think the NAS and maybe the Holman and the ESV say latter times or later days, something like that. You're going to see a little bit different phrase, but it means the very same thing, these latter days. That's what he's talking about in verse 1. Well, what does he talk about? Well, he hands down his blessing and he tells his sons what is going to become of their particular lineage or their tribes. And some of them don't sound very good. They don't sound very nice at all. As a matter of fact, some of them, their words are used like unstable. Words like violence, murder, anger. These aren't very pleasurable types of words. But then he gets to Judah, his son. And he tells Judah that the scepter will never depart from his lineage. Speaking specifically of the coming Messiah. And what is linked with the coming Messiah and what is linked with all of the bad things that's going to happen to some of the other sons? That very phrase, latter days. That time frame is going to come when these things will take place. And to Judah, he names specifically the coming Messiah. That's going to happen in the latter days. Numbers chapter 24, verse 14. Interesting story. We have a king of Moab by the name of Balak. He doesn't like Israel. He has heard some of the horror stories of how Israel is literally running through everybody, and he doesn't want any parts of them. They try to pass through his land. He doesn't want them passing through his land. So he hires a prophet of sorts named Balaam. Balaam was told by the king to pronounce curses on Israel. And we know that from reading the story. Every time Balaam opens his mouth, blessings come out. He wants to say bad things about Israel, but he can't. God is speaking through him. Well, we see here in this text, in verse number 14, he says this, I will let you know what will happen in the latter days. Here's that phrase again, the latter days. What is he speaking of? We can go right to verse 17. We see that he speaks of the coming Messiah. Now, when is that time frame? Go back to the latter days. This takes place in the latter days. Now, Hosea chapter 3, verse 5. We see yet another phrase that is very similar to this. Hosea was told to marry a prostitute. He does. They have a child. His wife Gomer runs back into the life of temple prostitution, and God says, go get her. This is a picture of God and Israel. The whole book here in Hosea is a picture of God and the unfaithful Israel. So God says, Gomer, I want you to go back and I want you to buy her back. And we know that Gomer does that. Hosea actually does that. He goes and buys back Gomer. But he's not able to pay full price, and we know that the money that he lacks, he makes up in dry goods, and he actually purchases her and brings her back. So, if we back up to verse number 4, it says that a time will come when Israel will be without a king, without a sacrifice, without ephod, meaning priests. And then verse number 5 says, afterward. Afterward. After this time, what time? The time that they don't have sacrifice, a king, without a priest. Afterward, they will return. They will return not only to the land of Jerusalem after their captivity in Babylon, but it goes even further and talks about they will return to their king, David. That's an issue because David has been dead in the grave and his bones dried up into dust for quite some time in Hosea's day. So he can't be speaking of King David himself. He's not. He's speaking of the greater David, Jesus. So they will return not only to Jerusalem and begin moving back into the sacrificial system, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls in the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, but in a greater sense, Hosea says, they will return to Christ after that time. Now, when does that time, once again, the same phrase is used, the latter days. Now, There are many other Old Testament passages that contain this very phrase. From Proverbs 5 to Jeremiah 23, from Psalm to Isaiah. So what we find with this phrase is that it could be a reference to a time that is general or unspecified, but later than the writing of that particular writer. Okay? Or it could be a specific time and a time frame yet to come. What is that time? As we've seen here in the Old Testament, it's actually the time of the coming Messiah. Now, how can I say that it could be, or it most likely is, the time frame of the coming Messiah? Because New Testament writers refer back to these latter days, and they call it the last days. Acts chapter 2, verse number 17. Peter's preaching at Pentecost, and he says, this right now is what Joel the prophet spoke about. And if you go back to Joel and you read what Joel is foretelling that will happen in Acts chapter 2, Joel uses the word in the last days. Same kind of framework here. In the last days, this will happen. Your men will dream dreams. They will speak prophecies. These things will happen, and it does. So Peter is saying in Acts 2, this is exactly what Joel spoke about back then. And again, Joel uses that phrase, in the last days. Hebrews chapter 1 reads, in times past God spoke through the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken by his Son. 2 Timothy chapter 3. So turn to 2 Timothy chapter 3. I'm going to stop on this one just for a second and read. And I want you to hear as I read, or read along with me and see if this doesn't sound familiar. 2 Timothy chapter 3. We're going to look at 1 through 5. And here's what Paul says to his letter to Timothy. But I know this, that in, how does that play out? The last days, perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, and from such people turn away. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 20. He says, he was made manifest, speaking of Christ, that one who came and shed his blood, he was made manifest in the last times. So, we see that the latter days in the Old Testament and the last days in the New Testament refer to a specific time frame which do not include the end of the world or the end of everything that we know. So, the latter days here in Daniel chapter 2, verse 28, is not at all the end times, or not at all the end of all things, but rather the times leading up to the coming Messiah. Remember, I asked as we go through this book to come into this without preconceived ideas. Come into this reading what the Scriptures have to say and looking at it contextually, looking at it historically, and that's what we're about to do. So don't have these preconceived ideas to where you're already looking at this saying, no, that doesn't line up with the way I believe it to line up. We're looking at what do the Scriptures actually say. So, the Old Testament foretold of the latter days, and the New Testament writers were in the last days. So what is the link between the two? Here it is. It was the supreme, single most significant event of all of history, the coming of Christ. This is not just an event, but the event that completely changed the course of history forever. Why? Because of what he accomplished. Everything from that point on was altered. Even time as we know it. We keep track of time differently now in the coming of Christ. Something as simple as that. So the Old Testament writers looked for it. The New Testament writers wrote about it and how it happened. And they all used the same time frame that it would take place. Latter times and last days. This time frame is between the coming of the promised Christ child and his triumphant return for his elect that he died for. And that is the very time in which we now live. Back in Daniel chapter 2, let me get back to my text. Back in Daniel chapter 2, this understanding of the latter days will govern how we interpret Daniel's prophecies. So if we understand them to mean the time of the end of the world or the time of the end of all things, we will be looking for something yet future for us today. However, if we understand the latter days to be a specific time frame between the first coming of the Lamb of God and the second coming of the Lion of Judah, we will look at events in Daniel a whole different way. So, let's get started into what in the world this king saw in this crazy dream. Read with me verses 31 to 35. Here's what Daniel says in the presence of the king. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partially of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them to pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Back to verse 31. Daniel says, you saw a great image. That was awesome. And he didn't mean it like that was totally radical. He meant it as in that day when they said that something was awesome, it actually struck fear. Something that was awesome would paralyze you with fear. And that's what happened to the king. Because you remember, he couldn't sleep after he'd seen this dream. He had been completely terrified. So, what was this awesome, fearful image? Well, it was a head of gold, as you see here in the picture, a chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet that were iron and clay mixed. Then a stone, not cut from human hands, hit the image on the feet, and the entire thing was turned to powder and blew away in the wind, to the point that not one trace of any of it could be found. Then the rock that hit the image crushed it to powder. That very rock that crushed that image to powder grew. And it turned into a mountain, and it filled the entire earth. Do you suppose, as Daniel has this conversation, that he has the king's full and undivided attention? I'll guarantee you he did. You know, I picture it as the king is right on the very edge of his seat, right? His crown's probably lobbed off to the side just a bit, and he is hanging on Daniel's every last word. He has his full and undivided attention because there has been no one in the kingdom able to tell the king what it was he dreamt. This is the first encounter. Look at verse 36 through 45. So he gets his attention and he begins to tell him this is what's going on here in verse 36. He says, this is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. And he begins. He says, you, O king, are king of kings. Notice he says, you are a king of kings. He doesn't refer to him as the king of kings. There's only one of those. He says, but you, king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom. He's given you power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of heaven, he has given them to your hand, and has made you ruler over all of them. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break into pieces and crush all others. Whereas you saw the feet and the toes, partially of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. I want to stop there just for a second and have us see that that last kingdom of iron is spoke of in the kingdom, not a separate kingdom. Because many will look at that and say, well, the legs of iron are one kingdom, and then the feet that are attached to those legs of iron are a different kingdom, and those kingdoms then divide. This is all one singular kingdom. That's why Daniel refers to it as the kingdom, not that kingdom. If he were to say that kingdom, he would be speaking of a different one. So we have one kingdom in the connection of the iron and the legs and the iron and the feet, along with the ceramic or the clay that's in those. And we know that you can't mix ceramic or clay with iron. It just doesn't mix. Those are two alloys that don't go together. Back to verse 42. And as the toes of feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom, see how he brings it back to that kingdom? The kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, okay, specific time frame, the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Back to verse 36. Daniel says, you, O king, are a king of kings. Nebuchadnezzar, you are the most powerful king in the world. By the way, Daniel goes on to give some more theology. He says, you don't have any kingdom that hasn't been handed to you from God. But that kingdom that has been handed to you from God is the most powerful kingdom in the world. And you, O king, are the most powerful king alive today. So, you, O king, are the head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar, in that moment, have you ever watched Where the Grinch Who Stole Christmas? When he hears the singing and he can't take the joy away from the hoo-haws or whoever they are in the village, that his heart grows 10 times big. right? Remember that in the movie? When Daniel says, "You are the head of gold," Nebuchadnezzar's head swelled just like the Grinch's heart. And you wouldn't have been able to fit Goliath's battle helmet on the king at this point, because he just heard, "I am the greatest." The greatest. And we're going to see here in the next chapter that he really believes that he's the greatest. It feeds into his thought process. So, Daniel moves on from that head of gold, and he speaks of another empire who will rule after Babylon. This kingdom is weaker, but it will prevail. This kingdom of silver is Persia. And we're going to see in chapter 6, we'll see how Persia takes over and Darius becomes king in the very land that they now have that's controlled by Babylon. Well, Persia will become very strong. They'll become a great empire, and they'll rule over the then known world, and this takes place between the years 550 BC and 336 BC. So they only last about 200 years. Daniel tells of the very next empire, the Bronze Empire, and we learn this from history. We don't see it in the scriptures, but we learn this from history. And we know that it's Greece. The Greek Empire, led by Alexander the Great. And by the way, Alexander the Great conquered everything there was to conquer in his day. And when that was over, he fell into a great depression. He was so depressed because there were no other lands that he could take over and occupy. And he actually dies at the age of 32. So the Greek Empire makes it about 200 years. And this brings us up to about the year 146 BC. So this brings us to the next takeover by the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay. And we know this to be Rome. How do we know that? Well, when we open up the pages of the New Testament, who is in charge of everything? Rome. They are a world-dominating power for about the next 450 years or so. However, just like God told Daniel, iron and clay can't mix, and this kingdom will not stay together. Well, in 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian decides that the empire is too large. And many of us remember this from our history lesson, our Bible history lesson that we had. Diocletian decides that the empire is just too large, so he actually divides it into two parts, the eastern and the western. And over the next 100 years or so, they actually reunite, only to split into three parts, then to split into two parts later on after that. Now, that's a very fast history lesson. Later when we get into Wednesday evenings and Sunday evenings, it may be a time to actually dig into that history and see a little deeper into that. But that's a fast history lesson of what has taken place in these worldly kingdoms up into the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay. And we know that to be Rome. Now, what about the last kingdom spoken of by Daniel? This little stone, not made by human hands. This kingdom that will never end was established in Jesus Christ. His kingdom started off small, started off insignificant in a small town called Bethlehem. This kingdom starts small and then grows into the longest, largest, lasting kingdom in all of history. Jesus told the Pharisees in Luke chapter 17, verse 21, "My kingdom is in your midst." It's here in your midst. It's here among you, not yet a future event. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 21, verse 44, listen as he speaks of that Old Testament prophecy here in Daniel. Notice Daniel talks about this stone that was carved out without human hands. It crushes everything in its wake. It takes care of all of the earthly kingdoms. He speaks of it as a rock. Jesus in Matthew 21:44 says, "The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." Paul says in Romans chapter 9, verse 33, he's quoting Isaiah, and he says this, "Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." You hear the same words? There's a reason that Daniel sees this rock. There's a reason that God gives the king a vision of this stone cut out without human hands that crushes every other empire. This kingdom is small, and it starts out small. But this rock takes over nations, not by military power, but rather by the most powerful thing on earth, the gospel of the king. See, Christ's kingdom has steamrolled over every dynasty since and will continue to do so. His triumphant return for his bride will be his crowning achievement. And time as we know it will be no longer. And we will live in the capital city of this kingdom forevermore. This dream of Nebuchadnezzar and the interpretation of this dream, these events were yet future for those in Daniel's day, as they looked for the latter days. However, as we have read from many Old Testament writers, the latter days for us has already taken place. And now we live in the last days. The last days are written of in the New Testament, and we are in them. Those are the days between the birth of Christ and his triumphant return for his bride. Well, look at verses 46 to the end of the chapter. We read here in Daniel 2, verse 46 to the end. "Then Nebuchadnezzar, after he heard what is about to happen, he fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, 'Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal the secret.' Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and the chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Also, Daniel petitioned the king and set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat at the gate of the king." Here at the end of this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar falls flat on his face in recognition of Daniel's God. In recognition of Daniel's God being the one who reveals dreams. See, the king promoted Daniel to the chief of all the wise men, and Daniel put in a good word for his friends, and the king promoted them as well. See, this chapter in Daniel shows the absolute sovereign authority of our holy God. This account is not as much about the worldly kingdoms that ruled the world at one time or another, but rather the focus is on Christ's kingdom and his power. However, we focus more on the timing of these earthly events, and in so doing, we minimize the power of Christ's kingdom. And with that minimization comes arguments and divisions. And this is a sad reality that takes place again and again. And some of these arguments become vicious. This should not be. Listen, I'm not under the conviction that our views of end times should divide us. I do, however, believe they should make lively fireside chat, but not divide us. And I know there are many who would not agree with that statement, and some of those that don't agree with that statement would actually not accept folks into membership if they don't line up with their particular view. Let's keep in mind that we are in this thing together. Here's what we need to practice. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. And in all things, charity. What do I mean by that? Well, essentials. Things like the virgin birth, That's essential. Christ's sinless life, his substitutionary death, his glorious resurrection, his intercession, his literal return. These are essentials. What do I mean by non-essentials? Well, how about tie or no tie? Psalms or hymns? Pews or chairs? Movies or no movies? Wine or no wine? And yes, even hard to understand prophecy. Now, I'm not talking about prophecy of the coming of Christ, things that we can see in the Old Testament and verify have happened in the New Testament. I mean things that are much harder to be dogmatic about. In all of those things, charity or love. Listen, I have to admit, when we agree with someone on essential matters, it makes it very easy to love them. But on non-essential issues, if we're not in step with others, there's a part of me that really doesn't want to love them as much. There is a sinful part of me that will even question the salvation of someone who doesn't line up exactly the way I do. And that sinful part of me, my old man, will destroy God-ordained healthy relationships to my shame. We must love one another in all things. In closing, keep in mind that the account in Daniel 2 is not as much about the earthly kingdoms. This is not about the gold kingdom. This is not about the silver kingdom, the bronze kingdom, the iron kingdom. Yes, they're mentioned, but that is not the pinnacle. The focus of Daniel chapter 2 is the rock. The kingdom of Christ. Christ the rock. This rock will grow until it becomes a mountain and covers the entire earth. His kingdom is growing. Even now, in these times today. Yes, you may say, I don't see it. Things look so bleak for his kingdom. It seems as if it maybe even has stalled out. Can I show us something from nature to help understand that? Mount Mauna Kea in Hawaii is the tallest mountain in the islands. It stands 13,800 feet above sea level. You can drive, actually, from sea level all the way to the top to the observatory that is at the top of Mount Mauna Kea. As you drive up the mountain, you actually drive through the clouds, and suddenly you break through the cloud cover into the heavens. However, this mountain is much taller than the almost 14,000 feet above sea level. How so? Mount Mauna Kea is actually a dead volcano. And it actually begins or extends below the water's surface to the ocean floor, making this mountain over 33,000 feet tall. It's so big and so heavy that it is actually pushing itself into the ocean floor. The greatest part of this mountain isn't even seen. We don't see it. It's below the water's surface, the greatest part of it, but it's still there. Christianity, in our eyes, may seem weak or at a standstill, but if we look, really look, it's growing. And this rock is becoming a mountain, and it is filling the earth. Listen, in China, Christianity is on track to be the largest number of Christians in the entire world by the year 2030. Larger than the United States, larger than Brazil. The gospel of Christ, the rock, is moving at the rate, listen to this, of 10,000 people a day in China. And I had to look that up to verify, because that sounded completely like, I don't get numbers like that. 10,000 a day, 70,000 people a week are coming to Christ in China. The rock is growing. The mountain is getting larger. Even if we can't see it from our vantage point. One other one. There's a small village between Burma and India. 1 century ago, 100 years ago, these folks were headhunters. Today, 90% of the population attend a Christian church every week. Christian leaders in this small village have set a goal of sending 10,000 missionaries to the rest of the world. The rock is growing. The mountain is moving, even if we can't see it from our vantage point. Listen, this rock, this king, is the only king who can rule the world and demand the allegiance of all people. Won't you trust him today? Won't you today get a piece of that rock? Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the truth that we see played out for us in your word. For these historical events that have taken place, and as we see them move forward, the metals in that dream become weaker and weaker. They become less pure and less pure. And then finally, just some old stone is thrown at this magnificent, awesome image and turns the whole thing to powder, showing us that Christ established his kingdom, and his kingdom will overthrow every worldly kingdom. Lord, I pray if there is someone in the sound of my voice today, that today they would trust that finished work of Jesus Christ done on their behalf and get plugged into this rock that is growing to a mountain that will fill the entire earth. And we thank you and praise you in the name of your Son. Amen.
It is well. It is well.